I gripped the edge of the blackjack table, the bright casino lights glaring down as if they too judged me. My son's voice carried across the felt, sharp enough for every stranger to hear. "She's our bad luck. Keep her away." Laughter flickered around me, chips clattering like cruel applause. Bad luck. After decades of sacrifice, of teaching him right from wrong, of being his mother, I was nothing more than a superstition. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The flashing lights of Atlantic City's famous casino floor flickered above Eleanor Price's head, casting an artificial glow that seemed to intensify the weight of the night. The constant hum of slot machines and distant cheers from winning players filled the air. At the blackjack table, the cards shuffled in rhythm with Eleanor's racing heartbeat. Her hands were steady, her mind calculating despite her age. She was a retired math teacher. She didn't need luck. She had numbers. David, her son, leaned in close, a forced smile on his eyes darting between her and the dealer. "Victor," he whispered just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Mom, you should leave this to us. You're just bad luck." Linda, his wife, nodded in agreement, casting a dismissive glance at Eleanor, who, for a moment, seemed lost in the shimmering lights of the casino. The words sliced through her like a blade. They'd been saying things like that for years, whispers about her age, her slowness, her irrelevance. But this time, it hurt differently. David had always been the reckless one, the gambler, but hearing him so openly dismiss her was like a final, unexpected betrayal. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. Victor, the dealer, adjusted his tie and flicked his wrist to deal the cards, but his sharp eyes had caught the exchange. He paused for a moment, sensing something deeper than just another family spat. The tension at the table was palpable, and for a moment, it felt like the entire casino held its breath. Maddie, Eleanor's granddaughter, sat beside her mother, watching with a mix of shame and confusion. Her gaze flickered from her mother's cold expression to her grandmother's still face, trying to make sense of what she was witnessing. Eleanor knew Maddie felt the weight of the moment, and it twisted something deep inside her. She'd tried for so long to shield her from the ugliness in their family, but here it was, laid bare. Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't react. She simply stood up, the quiet rustle of her chair the only sound breaking the silence. She hadn't said a word since David's cruel remark. But there was something else in her, something buried deep that was rising now. The casino lights felt oppressive, suffocating. With a soft breath she turned, her steps slow but deliberate, and walked away from the table. She didn't need to look back. She could feel their eyes on her. She didn't need to hear the dismissive chuckles either. This time, the sting of their judgment wasn't something she could simply ignore. She was too old to tolerate their cruelty, too wise to pretend she didn't see the way they had been circling, waiting for her to weaken. Finding a quiet spot by the row of slot machines, she slid into a chair. The cold, familiar sound of coins clinking against the metal was oddly soothing, like the rhythm of a song she'd always known. She stared at the flashing lights of the machine before her, but her mind was far away, lost in the harsh, unforgiving truth of what David had said. She didn't play the slots. She never did. It was all chance. Nothing like the games she'd taught in classrooms, where numbers had meaning. But now, she didn't know what to do with herself. Was this what her life had become? A random pull on a lever? A spin of fate, dictated by others? The soft tap of shoes behind her broke her thoughts. It was Victor. He was standing just behind her, leaning casually against a column. His eyes, unreadable but sharp, met hers. "Bad luck?" he asked, his voice low, just above a "Numbers tell another story." Eleanor didn't immediately respond. She knew the comment was meant to be more than a passing remark. Victor had seen something. Perhaps he knew more than he was letting on. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. There was something about him, his quiet understanding, that made her feel as though she wasn't alone in this. She turned her gaze to him slowly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "I'll remember this," she whispered, her voice as soft as the click of the machine's lever. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The kind of promise a woman makes when she knows she's been pushed too far. And in that moment, Eleanor Price knew she was standing on the edge of something big, something would change everything. Victor nodded, and with a small, almost imperceptible smile, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Eleanor sat still, her mind racing but her body steady. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain now: the game had changed, and this time, the dealer wasn't in control. As she sat there staring at the slot machine in front of her, she thought of the years spent teaching, calculating, watching others with sharp eyes. The odds had always been in her favor, if she could just find the right number. And now, the right numbers had found her. She would not let them, not this time. Eleanor sat in the quiet corner casino, the hum of machines and chatter around her now a distant murmur. The words from the blackjack table echoed in her mind like a broken record, but the sting of David's insult was fading. Something else had taken its place. A quiet, simmering anger that she wasn't sure how to handle. She wasn't weak. No, she wasn't weak. She had lived a life of numbers, logic, and order. If anyone could expose the truth, it was her. The image of Victor's face, his calm eyes, and the cryptic words, "Numbers tell another story," flickered in her. The weight of his statement settled heavily on her chest. He had seen something she wasn't yet sure. But she knew one thing now. She couldn't just sit here and let them continue to play her for a fool. Not David, not Linda. They thought she was slipping. They thought she was slow. But she was anything but. With a sharp breath, she stood up from her, feeling the cool air of the casino wash over her. She needed answers. And answers, she knew, lay in the footage. The casino's security cameras could track everything. If David had been using her name, exploiting her, she would find it. No more guessing, no more waiting. Victor's words repeated in her mind as she walked toward the security desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor with a quiet determination. She approached the guard behind the counter, who glanced up briefly before looking back at his monitor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'd like to review some footage from last night, specifically from the blackjack table." The guard didn't look up immediately, but when he did, it was with the air of someone who had seen this type of request before. "We don't usually release footage to guests," he said, especially for something like this, family disputes. "I'm not here for a family Eleanor interrupted, her eyes narrowing just enough for the guard to sense the seriousness in her tone. "I believe a crime was committed." The guard hesitated, clearly sizing her up, but something in her demeanor, the quiet resolve in her eyes, made him pause. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard and gestured toward the monitor. "I'll see what I can do." The footage played, grainy at first, but as the frames flickered, Eleanor's focus sharpened. There, in the corner of the frame, was David. His movements were quick, almost too quick, but unmistakable. With a slight motion, he pocketed a stack of chips, his hand sliding casually under the table. He glanced up, but the camera angle was perfect. It captured everything. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the footage played out. It wasn't just a slip of the hand. It wasn't an accident. It was calculated, deliberate. David had been stealing from the table. Her chest tightened, a sense of disbelief creeping in. How had he been able to do this so easily? The guard watched her closely, but his expression remained. "That's it," he said, his voice flat. "There's not much more we can do. If there's a family dispute involved, it's not our place to get involved." Eleanor's stomach twisted. The nonchalance of the guard's response, his dismissal of what she knew was a serious crime, made something snap inside her. She knew that the theft wasn't just from casinos and it wasn't just a family squabble. David's games weren't just about money, they were about power. And now, it was clear, he was using her, and he had been for a long time. She left the security desk, her mind racing. Maddie had been right all along. David wasn't just gambling with chips, he was gambling with their lives. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Maddie. Eleanor answered quickly, trying to keep her voice even. "Grandma, I'm so sorry about what happened at the table," Maddie said, her voice small and hesitant. "I didn't know he was doing all this." Eleanor felt a sharp pang in her chest. She could hear the weight of Maddie's guilt. The girl didn't deserve this. She shouldn't be caught in the crossfire of her parents. "I know, sweetheart," Eleanor said quietly, her voice softening. "They think I'm weak, but I'm watching. I'm watching everything now." Maddie didn't say anything for a moment, but Eleanor could hear the unspoken promise in her granddaughter's silence. She was with her. She would help. As Eleanor turned to leave the security office, she felt a shift in the air. The walls of the casino felt less like a maze of chance and more like a battlefield, one she had been thrust in. It was no longer about the blackjack table. It was no longer about games. It was about her life, her money, and the future she had worked too hard to build. And David? He had underestimated. She would make him regret that. Her steps were measured as she moved through the crowd, the low murmur of the casino, and somewhere, deep inside, Eleanor felt a fire ignite, a determination that she had almost forgotten she still had. She wasn't going to let her son take everything. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't about luck anymore. This was about truth. And truth, like numbers, always found a way to reveal itself. The phone call came early the next morning. The bright sunlight streaming through the half-open curtains did little to calm the storm that had been brewing in Eleanor's mind all night. She had barely slept, her thoughts tumbling over each other in an endless loop of betrayal and quiet rage. The casino footage played over and over in her head, but now there were other pieces to fit into place. David's theft wasn't just about the chips. It wasn't just a family spat. It was bigger than that. And Eleanor had a sinking feeling that it was going to get a lot uglier before it got better. "Mrs. Price?" The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, but with a quiet weight to it that made Eleanor sit up straighter. "This is Carol Jensen from the bank. I need to inform you that there have been some suspicious withdrawals from your accounts." Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. Her mind raced. "Suspicious withdrawals? I didn't authorize anything." There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. "There have been multiple transactions over the past few, large sums, transferred to new accounts that aren't under your name." Eleanor's stomach twisted, and her breath caught in her chest. She'd known this. She had known, deep down, that David's scheme wasn't just confined to the casino. He had always been good at using people, manipulating them, taking advantage of their trust. But this? I'm going to need to speak with someone about this. Eleanor, her voice low and controlled. "This isn't just a mistake. I want to know who's behind these withdrawals." "I'll escalate this to our fraud department," Jensen replied. "You should expect a call from Officer Carla Ruiz. She's handling the investigation." Eleanor barely registered the rest of the conversation as her mind spun. Officer. That name echoed through her thoughts like a bell. A financial crimes investigator. Someone who didn't take no for an answer. It was what she needed. Someone who could cut through the lies and uncover the truth. The call ended, but the weight of what it meant lingered in the air like smoke. Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of the table, her mind already spinning with the possibilities. David had opened new accounts in her name, used her identity to siphon money from her accounts, leaving her in the dark, all while she was too distracted with his game. The betrayal was thick in the air, a heavy, suffocating thing. She needed proof. She needed to track the number. Her hands moved mechanically to the drawer by the desk, pulling out the binder she'd started the night before. On the cover, in careful, precise handwriting, she'd labeled it, "Proof." Inside, she had already begun compiling the trail of breadcrumbs, statements, dates, and the scattered details she could gather from her bank's alerts. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed the trail to lead somewhere concrete, somewhere she could stand on in court, in front of a judge, and say, "This is what he did. This is how he used me." Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her blouse as she walked toward it. She opened it to find Maddie standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with something between confusion and guilt. "Maddie," Eleanor said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "What's wrong?" Maddie hesitated before speaking, looking down at the floor as if the words were too heavy to bear. "Grandma, I heard Dad talking last night. He bragged about opening new accounts under your name, said it was part of his plan to get control of everything." Eleanor's heart sank. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a rush of cold through her veins. David wasn't just gambling with her money. He was trying to take everything, control, assets, her entire life, and tie it to his reckless scheme. "Did he say where?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice calm, though inside her rage was building. Maddie's face crumpled slightly. "He didn't say much more, but I heard him talking to Mom about it, about how easy it was, how no one would notice." Eleanor's fists clenched. That was it then. That was the final piece. She had been right all along. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, about control. And David thought he could get away with it because he believed no one was watching. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the binder on the table. The evidence she had been gathering was only the beginning, but it was enough to start connecting the dots. The numbers were there. He had left a trail, just like Victor had said. "Thank you, Maddie," Eleanor said quietly, her voice low but full of conviction. "You've helped me more than you know." Maddie didn't answer, but she looked up, meeting her grandmother's eyes with a glimmer of something, respect, maybe even admiration. As Maddie left the room, Eleanor returned to the binder, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. She knew what had to be done next. The numbers were there. They were always there. And she was going to follow them, no matter where they led. Victor's words echoed again in her mind. Numbers leave trails. Follow them. She would follow them, all the way to the end. And when she reached that end, David would have nowhere to hide. The quiet determination in her chest grew, tightening into something sharper. The game was just beginning. The knock on Eleanor's door was sharp and purposeful, like a judgment waiting to be delivered. She didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. David's voice, as usual, oozed with a mixture of charm and condescension. "Mom, we need to talk." She hadn't been expecting this, at least, not so soon. Eleanor wasn't surprised by the visit, but she was more than ready for it. She had to play her part carefully, act confused, hesitant, while keeping every piece of the puzzle in line. She opened the door slowly, her face deliberately blank. David stood there, wearing his usual concerned son expression, his eyes glinting with a hint of behind him, Linda hovered, ever the silent enforcer. "Hi, Mom," David said, his tone syrupy. "We've been talking, and we think it's time for you to sign this." He handed her a stack of papers, a legal-looking document with the words, "Power of Attorney," boldly typed across the top. Eleanor didn't take it immediately. Instead, she eyed the papers with a feigned confusion, pretending to study them as if they were a foreign language. Her mind raced, the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but she kept her expression neutral. She had to play it right. David leaned in slightly, his voice low and coaxing. "It's for your protection, Mom. You're not getting any younger, and things are getting a little complicated. You've got to let us handle things." Eleanor looked at him, then at Linda, who gave her the same cold, calculating stare she always had. It was clear that this wasn't about protecting her. It was about control. "I don't know," Eleanor said softly, her voice full of hesitation. "I've been thinking, maybe I should talk to my lawyer first, just to be sure." David's smile faltered just for a split second. "Mom, there's no time for that. We're trying to help you. You know how much we've done for you, how much we've taken care of you. It's all about making sure you're Linda chimed in, her voice as sharp as ever. "It's really for your own good, Eleanor. You don't need to overthink this." Eleanor felt a sickening chill wash over her at Linda's words. She wanted to lash out, scream, but she knew better. Instead, she let her confusion linger, like a veil of fog over her sharp insight. Eleanor paused, letting the silence hang between them. "I need some time." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his smile firmly in. "Of course. Take your time, Mom. We'll be right here when you're ready." His voice softened, but there was a dangerous edge to it, a threat masked by concern. As they turned to leave, Eleanor took the papers in her hand, the weight of them heavy in her palm. She didn't let her hand tremble. She didn't let the storm brewing inside her show. Once the door clicked shut behind them, Eleanor's fingers went to work. She fished out her phone, dialing the number she had already memorized. Rachel Meyer, her elder law attorney, answered on the first ring. "Eleanor?" Rachel's voice was sharp. "No nonsense. What's going on?" "I need your help," Eleanor said quietly, looking down at the power of attorney. Her grip on the phone tight. "David and Linda are trying to get me to sign something. They say it's for my protection, but I don't trust them. What should I do?" Rachel was silent for a moment, and Eleanor could almost hear the wheels turning on the other end of the line. "Do not sign it," Rachel said firmly. "It's a ploy, Eleanor. They're trying to get control of everything. You need to get those papers away from them, and you need to keep everything hidden. Do you understand?" Eleanor swallowed hard, nodding even though Rachel couldn't. "I understand." "Good. We'll prepare. I'll get everything in order on my end. Just keep your distance and don't make any sudden move. I'll be in touch." The call ended with a soft click, and Eleanor sat there, staring at the phone in her hand. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't completely alone in this. Rachel would help. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She stood and walked across the room to the small safe she kept hidden in the back of her closet. The bank alerts she'd been hiding, alerts about suspicious withdrawals, the new accounts David had opened in her name, were neatly filed inside. She placed the stack of papers in the safe, locking it with a soft click. As she turned to leave the room, the door opened quietly and Maddie slipped in, her eyes wide with concern. "Grandma!" I heard what happened." Maddie's voice trembled, but there was determination behind it. "You're not alone in this. I'll help you." Eleanor turned to face her granddaughter, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and love. She didn't want Maddie to be dragged into this mess, but she knew the girl was already in too deep. She would help her. They'd fight this together. I know, sweetheart. I know. Eleanor gave her a small, reassuring smile. And we'll win. I'll make sure of it. The weight of the moment settled between them, unspoken but understood. They were in this together now. As Maddie walked out, Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, her heart racing. The storm was coming. David and Linda might think they had control, but Eleanor had something they didn't: the truth. And that was something no one could take away. The game was still on, and this time, she wasn't playing by their rules. Eleanor walked through the labyrinth of the casino, her heels clicking against the marble floor with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. The bright lights and clattering noise of slot machines had always felt like a world apart, but now, it was her battleground. She was walking into a storm she'd barely begun to understand, and yet every step felt deliberate, every thought calculated. She was finally going to get the answers she needed. The staff lounge, a small and unassuming room tucked away from the gambling floor, smelled faintly of coffee and bleach. It was quiet, too quiet, and Eleanor's presence felt almost out of place. She hadn't been here before, and yet the door swung open with an unspoken invitation. Victor stood by the coffee machine, a silent figure in the dim light. He was waiting for her, as if he knew she was coming. You wanted to see me? Victor's voice was low, but there was something unspoken in something that said he knew exactly what was at stake. Eleanor nodded, her heart thumping in her chest. I need to know what happened with my player card, she said, keeping her voice steady, but the words came out more like a command than a question. How was it used? Victor studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes assessing. He didn't answer immediately, but after a long pause he turned and gestured for her to sit. She did, stiffly, as he pulled a folder from a nearby cabinet, flipping it open with a swift motion. The papers inside were neat, methodical, like everything else about Victor. There's something you should know, he said, and Eleanor noticed the subtle shift in his expression, as if he were preparing her for something she didn't want to hear. He handed her the ledger, its pages filled with rows of numbers, dates, and amount, lines upon lines that all led to one conclusion. The words Eleanor Price jumped out at her in bold, glaring print. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she scanned the page. Her name, her player card. She wasn't a big spender. She didn't even play the slots. But the numbers told another story. A story of bets placed, of debts accrued, of a losing streak that wasn't hers to own. Victor watched her silently as she took in the information. His face was unreadable, but the heaviness in his eyes told her that he knew exactly what this meant. I knew it, Eleanor whispered to herself, her fingers gripping the edges of David. He used my identity. Victor nodded. He used your card, your information. Everything was tied to you. The casino saw you as a big spender, someone who could lose and still come back for more. He paused, his voice softening. But it wasn't just gambling, Eleanor. It's worse than that. Eleanor sat back, her mind racing. What do you mean? Victor's gaze shifted toward the door as if ensuring they were still alone, then back at her. David didn't just use your name to gamble. He's been racking up debts in your name, using your identity to secure credit from the casino. You're the one on record, not him. The debts are under your name, and when he loses, he walks away, leaving you to carry the weight. Eleanor's stomach turned as she processed the information. Her son had done this, used her, his mother, to create a mess of debts that she would now be responsible. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the way he'd manipulated, the way he'd made her an accomplice without her knowing it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A woman with a no-nonsense air stepped into, her heels clicking against the tile. Eleanor turned to face her, and instinctively, she straightened up. This was Officer Carla Ruiz, the financial crimes investigator who had been assigned to her case. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Eleanor Price? Officer Ruiz's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. I've reviewed the document, and we've confirmed that your identity was used to rack up significant gambling debt. We're currently working to trace the transfers and other illegal transactions. Eleanor didn't know whether to feel relief or dread at the confirmation. She had suspected it all along, but now it was real. It wasn't just about the stolen money, it was about betrayal. And David had gone too far. Ruiz glanced at Victor, who nodded subtly. The officer turned back to Eleanor, her face unwavering. You didn't authorize these transactions, did you? No, Eleanor replied firmly. I didn't. Ruiz's eyes softened, just slightly. Then this is identity theft, fraud, and it's going to take everything we have to nail down every piece of it. Eleanor felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Her son had used her trust and turned it into a weapon, but she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not anymore. Victor leaned in slightly, his voice quiet, but his words cutting through the tension like a knife. This isn't gambling, Eleanor. This is exploitation. Your son used you like a pawn, and now it's time to turn the tables. Eleanor's heart pounded. She wasn't sure if it was fear or fury that had taken, but one thing was clear. She wasn't about to let David win. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was laced with iron. He bet against me. I'll bet against him. The words settled over her like a cloak, wrapping her in a quiet, determined resolve. She wasn't going to play by his rules and she wasn't just the victim in this game. She was going to flip the board over, and this time, she was going to win. Victor stepped back, giving her space, but the flicker of approval in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. Officer Ruiz, too, seemed to respect the quiet strength that radiated from Eleanor. As the room seemed to shrink around her, Eleanor knew the battle had only just begun. David had made one fatal mistake. He'd underestimated his mother. The courtroom was cold, its sterile walls a silent reminder of the battle that was about to unfold. Eleanor stood at the back, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She had been through countless classrooms, countless meetings with parents and colleagues in her lifetime. But this was different. This wasn't about numbers in a textbook. This was about her life, her dignity, and her very future, and she would not let David take it from her. The buzz of whispered conversations and the shuffle of papers filled the room as people filed in. Her son, David, sat near the front, his face a picture of feigned concern. Beside him, Linda sat with her usual cold detachment, her eyes scanning the room with an almost predatory precision. It was clear they thought they had the upper hand. They thought the same thing as always, that Eleanor was old, frail, and easily manipulated. But they were wrong. Eleanor was not weak. Victor, whom Eleanor had come to trust, was seated in the gallery, his eyes scanning the room with careful precision. Rachel Meyer, her attorney, stood at her side, a reassuring presence in a sea of hostility. The court was set to hear David's claims that Eleanor was delusional, unfit to handle her own affairs. The accusations were absurd, but the truth didn't matter to people like David and Linda. They wanted control, and they would use anything at their disposal to take it. As the gavel struck, signaling the beginning of the hearing, Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the binder she held in her lap. She had everything she needed: the bank alerts, the casino records, the medical claim, each piece of evidence meticulously prepared. David had underestimated her once again. He thought that by pushing her, by belittling her, he could make her give up. But he didn't know what she had inside her. The judge, a stern woman named Teresa Holloway, looked down at the papers in front of her. Her eyes flicked from the documents to the faces of those gathered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Price," Judge Holloway began, her voice firm, "you claim that your mother is delusional and unfit to handle her own affairs. Please present your case." David stood, his face a mask of feigned concern, and began speaking in smooth, practiced. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with the scent of rehearsed sorrow, "my mother is no longer capable of managing her own finance. She's been forgetful, irrational, and, frankly, I'm concerned for her well-being. She's no longer the person she once was." Eleanor's heart tightened at his words, but she refused to flinch. This was just part of his act, part of the story he had been spinning to take control. She had lived long enough to see the true face of manipulation, and she would not let him succeed. Rachel stood up to counter. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear, "my client has undergone a medical examination. The results are in the records before you. There is no cognitive decline, no evidence of any mental illness or impairment. Eleanor Price is perfectly capable of handling her own affairs." David's face faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. He had been so sure this would work, but Rachel's words were like a shield, protecting Eleanor from the barrage of lies. Then, Rachel turned to the judge and with quiet confidence called Victor to the stand. Victor stood with ease, his sharp eyes never leaving the judge's face. He had agreed to testify, knowing the truth would change everything. "Mr. Chen," Judge Holloway said, her voice neutral, "please tell the court what you know about the financial activities of Mrs. Price." Victor cleared his throat before speaking, his tone calm but unwavering. "Your Honor, I work at the casino where Mrs. Price's son David has been gambling. I've reviewed the record, and it's clear that David has been using Mrs. Price's player card to rack up significant gambling debts. These debts are in her name, not his. The casino saw her as a big spender, and he used that perception to secure credit, leaving her responsible for his losses. The courtroom fell silent. The weight of Victor's words hung in the air like an iron cloud. David's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he struggled to make composure. He had thought he could hide the truth, but now it was out there for everyone to see. Eleanor remained calm, though inside, her fury was a quiet storm. How could he? How dare he? But she wouldn't let the anger consume her. Not now. Not when the tide was finally turning in her favor. David's lawyer stood up, attempting to salvage the situation. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice strained. "This is irrelevant. We're here to determine Mrs. Price's mental state, not her financial transaction." Judge Holloway's gaze flicked over the lawyer, unimpressed. "The financial transactions are directly related to the question of her fitness to handle her own affairs. Your objection is overruled." Eleanor could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, and though she remained silent, she could sense their disbelief, their judgment of her son. He was losing his grip, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur of legal jargon and argument, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on David, sitting there in the front row, his false concerns unraveling in front of everyone. He had used her trust to build a web of lies and deceit, but now she had the power to expose him for what he truly was. Maddie, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room, caught Eleanor's gaze for a brief moment. Eleanor could see the unease in her granddaughter's eyes, the way Maddie avoided looking at her. She was caught in the middle of a war she never asked, but Eleanor knew one thing for certain. Maddie was on her side. She always had been. The hearing was adjourned for the day, and as Eleanor stood, her heart still racing, she knew the real battle was only just beginning. David's lies had been exposed, but there was still so much to be done. The road ahead would be long, but Eleanor was no longer afraid. David had made one final mistake. He had underestimated again, and this time she was going to make sure he paid the price. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light filtering through the window in muted shades of gold. The space felt calm, almost serene, but the weight of the papers before her was anything but. She had been staring at them for what felt like hours. Bank statements, receipts, legal documents. Every number, every name, every detail, the thread in the web that David had spun around her. A web she was now untangling, piece by piece. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked to the door. When she opened it, there stood Rachel Meyer, her attorney, holding a thick folder in her. "Eleanor," Rachel said, her voice firm but compassionate. "We've got the audit results." Eleanor's stomach tightened. This was it. The final confirmation that David's betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about control. It was about exploiting her in ways she hadn't even imagined. They sat at the kitchen table, and Rachel spread the documents across it like a surgeon laying out the tools for a delicate procedure. The forensic accountant's report was thorough, painstakingly. "This is where we start," Rachel said, pointing to a chart that showed David's gambling debt. "These are all the debts incurred by your son using your identity. The amounts are staggering." Eleanor studied the numbers. David had racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in gambling losses, all in her name, using her player card at the casino. But what struck her, the hardest, were the notes in the margin. Additional charges, credit extension, all tied to her. The debts weren't just at the casino. They'd spread into other areas, other accounts. As Rachel flipped through more pages, Eleanor's eyes caught a new line item, one that made her heart drop. "Linda?" she whispered, her voice shaking just a little. Rachel nodded, her eyes meeting Eleanor. "Yes, Linda's purchases. We traced several high-end purchases, luxury goods, travel expenses, all charged to accounts opened in your name, with your consent on the form. But it wasn't you, Eleanor." The weight of the realization hit like a blow to the chest. David wasn't just gambling away her money. Linda had been in on it too. They had both worked together to deceive her, to use her finances for their own gain. It wasn't just David. It was Linda too. They had been co-conspirators in this whole scheme, both of them lining their pockets with her life's saving. Eleanor felt her hands tighten around the edges of the paper. She had always known Linda was cold, calculating, but this was betrayal in its most cruel form. The thought of it, her own daughter-in-law, the woman who had smiled at her in family gathering, being part of this deception, made her blood run cold. Rachel flipped the last page, showing a timeline she had painstakingly compiled. It was a roadmap of fraud, with every key moment outlined. David's first withdrawal under her name, the first large purchase made by Linda, the first time they had accessed her accounts without her consent. It was all there, a systematic exploitation of her trust. "I've got everything," Rachel said, her voice measured but filled with resolve. "This timeline will show the judge exactly how they've been systematically using you for months, maybe longer. This isn't just a case of bad luck or poor judgment. This is fraud. This is elder exploitation." Eleanor felt something shift within her. It wasn't just anger now, it was clarity. She had been living in the fog of disbelief, unsure of how far David and Linda had gone. But now, she saw it all laid out before her. This wasn't just a son trying to control his aging mother. This was a full-scale operation designed to strip her of everything she had worked for. As Eleanor skimmed the last few pages, she came across a set of text messages that made her blood run cold. The sender was David, the recipient was someone named Matt, a friend or acquaintance, someone who clearly didn't know what was going on in Eleanor's life. Maddie had slipped into the room unnoticed and stood behind her, looking over her shoulder. She had been so quiet that Eleanor hadn't even realized she was there until Maddie's voice broke the silence. "Grandma, these are the texts I was telling you about," she said softly, pointing to the phone screen Eleanor had opened. "Dad bragging about all the new accounts he opened in your name, about how easy it was to get you to sign things." Eleanor's heart sank as she read the text, each word hitting her like a punch to the gut. David had been so confident in his manipulation of, so sure that she wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight back. The texts weren't just about money, they were about how he thought he had control. "Matt, don't worry. It's easy. Mom will sign anything. She trusts me. And the best part? I can drain her accounts without her even knowing. She'll never catch on." Eleanor's hands shook as she put the phone down. This was more than theft. This was emotional manipulation. David had made her feel like she was the one losing control, when in reality, it was him all along. Maddie, who had been so quiet, now spoke with a determined edge in her. "Grandma, we have to make this right. We can't let them get away with this." Eleanor nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "No, sweetheart, we won't." She stood up, gathering the document to a neat pile and slipping them into the binder. Every piece of evidence, every small detail, was a nail in the coffin for David and Lynn. They had thought they could fool her. They had thought they could break her. But they were wrong. As Officer Carla Ruiz had said earlier, this is textbook elder exploitation. But Eleanor wasn't just a victim, and she was the one writing the book on how to take control back. Eleanor felt the weight of the binder, and this was the moment she had been waiting for. And as she walked toward the door, her steps were lighter, her heart steadier. She was done being their pawn. This was her fight now, and she was going. The air in Eleanor's living room was thick with tension, as if the very walls could sense the storm brewing. It had been a few days since the audit, and though things had moved forward with the case, a sense of dread still lingered. The house, once a place of refuge, felt more like a battleground now. She hadn't expected it to come to this, David's next move. But then again, he had always been unpredictable, always manipulative. His arrogance had grown with each passing day, and now he stood in her living room, blocking her only exit, his expression darker than ever. "You think you've won, don't you?" David's voice was low, edged with a quiet fury that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "You think you've got me cornered with all your evidence and your little lawyer friends, but you're wrong. This isn't over." Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she stood facing him. Her heart was steady now, a far cry from the woman who had been manipulated into silence for years. No, she was not that woman. She had faced worse than this, years of self-doubt, of neglect. And now, this was nothing. It was just one final game. "I don't need to win," Eleanor said calmly, her voice carrying an icy conviction. "You've already lost." David's lips curled into a snarl, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't get it, Mom. You're done. No one's going to believe you. No one cares about your little crusade. All they'll see is a delusional old woman trying to tear apart her own family. You think Rachel and that cop can protect you?" Eleanor didn't flinch. The woman who had raised David, who had made excuses for his behavior, was long gone. This was the Eleanor who had taken control back, who had seen her son's cruelty for what it was. "You may have tried to use me, Dave," she said quietly, her voice like steel. "But I won't let you destroy me. Not anymore." Behind them, Maddie stood just inside the doorway, her phone discreetly hidden in her, recording every word of the confrontation. She hadn't wanted to be part of this battle, but she couldn't sit by anymore. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched David's every move. His arrogance, his fury was palpable, and for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. This was her grandmother's fight, and Maddie had promised her no more silent. David's eyes flicked to Maddie, his gaze darkening. He knew she was recording. It was the same game he had always played, one that he thought he could control. But this time, the power had shifted. "You're making a huge mistake, Dave," Maddie said, her voice steady but fierce. "This is on tape. Everything you've said." David's face contorted, a flash of panic passing over, but it quickly turned back to rage. "You think that will matter? No one will care about your little video. You're all just trying to ruin me. You're just as bad as she is. You're all against me." Eleanor's expression remained calm, unwavering. She knew what was coming. She could feel the rage simmering beneath David's surface, knew he couldn't contain it much longer. The truth always had a way of drawing out the worst in. David took a step closer to Eleanor, his voice rising. "You are nothing without me, Mom. Do you really think anyone cares about you? You're just an old woman, alone. Nobody will believe you. I'll tear your life apart, and there's nothing you can do about it." Eleanor's heart didn't race. It didn't even skip a beat. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on him, unwavering. She had seen this version of David too many times, always ready to lash out when things didn't go his way. But this time, it was different. She took a step back, her voice calm but firm. "It's over, David. You're out of moves." For a moment, David stood there, staring at her, as if waiting for the world to change with his threat. But it didn't. His fury was an empty weapon now. He had no power left. "Do you really think you can scare me?" Eleanor asked softly. "You've already lost. All the threats, all the lies, they mean nothing anymore. Paper beats temper, every time." David's eyes burned with frustration, but he could do nothing now. His anger fizzled out into something far darker, desperation. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The walls were closing in around him, and he knew it. Behind them, Rachel entered the room, her gaze sharp as always. "David, it's over. We've got everything we need. This is bigger than just you. You're not going to walk away from this." David's head snapped toward Rachel, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood firm, her presence commanding and resolute. "You can't manipulate your way out of this anymore. You've crossed a line." Rachel continued, her voice low but full of authority. "You're facing fraud charges, elder exploitation, identity theft. And now, I'm filing for a restraining order. You'll be barred from coming near your mother." David's face twisted in disbelief. "You think you can stop me? I'll fight this. You've already lost." Rachel cut him off, her words final. "Your lies are exposed. We'll make sure of it." David's fists clenched once more, but now, they held no power. The game was over. He could see it in Eleanor's eyes. She had won. Maddie stepped forward, holding out her phone. "This is over, Dad," she said softly, the quiet strength in her voice echoing. "And you don't have control anymore." Eleanor, looking at her granddaughter, couldn't help but smile. The tension of the moment slowly lifted. They had fought together, and they would continue to. David backed away slowly, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. His threats no longer had any weight. He was powerless now, nothing more than a shadow in the room. As he turned and walked out, Eleanor felt a strange peace wash over her. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles ahead, but for the first time, she was no longer afraid of her son, and that, in itself, was a victory. The storm was over. The next morning, Eleanor opened her front door to find a stack of newspapers on the doorstep. The ink was still fresh, and as she reached down to grab them, a cold realization set in. The headlines were unavoidable. The first article she picked up was emblazoned with bold letters: "Family betrayal, local woman, fights back against elder exploit." Eleanor felt a rush of a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had always kept to herself, a quiet observer of the world around her. Now her name was splashed across the front page, and not as the quiet widow who had been taken advantage of. No, this was different. This was the story of the woman who had fought back, who had won. The rest of the article was a detailed account of the investigation, complete with quotes from Rachel Meyer, the police, and even a statement from Officer Carla Ruiz, who had worked tirelessly to bring David's crimes to light. The piece also included a chilling quote from the forensic accountant who had uncovered the depths of David's manipulation, outlining the full extent of his fraudulent activity. Eleanor paused for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle over. Her story was no longer just a private one, it was public. The truth was out. As she turned to head back inside, she noticed her neighbors gathered outside, whispering amongst themselves, their eyes flicking toward her door. Eleanor straightened her back, her chin lifted. She had earned this moment. They had all watched as her life had slowly unraveled at the hands of her son, but now they were witnessing her rebuilding it. One of her neighbors, Mrs. Callahan, a woman she had known for years, gave her a small nod. "You did good, Eleanor. We're proud of you," she said quietly, her voice almost reverent. Another neighbor, a man named Greg, clapped her gently on the shoulder. "If you ever need anything, we're here for you. You're not alone in this." Eleanor felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. The people she had once thought of as distant were now allies, standing behind her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging, of support. But there was a darker undercurrent. As she closed the door behind her, she could hear muffled voices from the street, gossip beginning to spread like wildfire. Inside, the quiet buzz of the house felt different, calmer, almost peaceful. But there was still work to be done. There were still pieces of her life to reclaim. She needed to prepare for what was next. As she sat at the kitchen table with Rachel later that morning, the conversation turned to the next phase of the battle. The civil case against David and Linda was gaining momentum. Rachel had already filed the paperwork to freeze David's asset, ensuring he couldn't use any of his stolen funds to defend himself. "They'll fight it," Rachel warned, her voice measured but filled with certainty. "David will blame you, drag your name through the mud, but we've got the facts on our side." Eleanor nodded, her mind already focused on the next step. "I don't care what he says," she said, her voice a little stronger than before. "I don't play cards. I play truth." Rachel smiled at her, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Exactly. And truth always wins." The afternoon slipped into evening, and as Eleanor sat by her window, watching the last vestiges of daylight fade, she could feel the weight of her decision. She had made it through the storm, but now the real fight had begun. There was a war ahead of her, one that would stretch beyond the courtroom and into the social fabric of her life. David was furious. He couldn't understand how things had turned on him so quickly. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that he was dealing with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Linda, too, was feeling the once the queen of their small social circle, she was now humiliated, her reputation in tatters. The phone calls had started, the whispers behind her back, but no one was coming to her defense anymore. The community that had once adored her now saw her for what she was, a co-conspirator, a thief in the shadows. Eleanor stood up from the window and turned to face Maddie, who had been sitting quietly across from her, watching the evening unfold. "You've been through so much, Grandma," Maddie said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "I don't know how you—" Eleanor smiled, walking over to her granddaughter and sitting down beside her. "I do it because I have to. For you, for me, for all of us. We're stronger than they ever thought we were." Maddie nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She had always known her grandmother was strong, but now, seeing her stand in the face of everything, she realized just how much strength it took to rebuild after everything. "You're not alone anymore," Maddie said quietly, squeezing her. "We're a team." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze flicking toward the small worn photo on the mantel, a picture of her and her late husband, their smiles frozen in. It was just a photograph, but it reminded her of everything she had fought for, everything she had lost, and everything she was going to rebuild. Outside, the world was starting to shift. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, they were all part of the storm. But this time, Eleanor wasn't afraid of the thunder. She had survived it once, and now she was going to make sure David paid for the havoc he. The headlines had told her story, but the real truth was in the quiet moment like this, standing tall, with the people who truly mattered at her side. And as Eleanor whispered to her, she knew one thing: truth always. The day of the grand jury hearing arrived with an electric tension in the air, a silent anticipation that wrapped around Eleanor like a tight band. The courthouse loomed before her, its cold stone facade reflecting the weight of the fight ahead. But Eleanor felt a strange calm, an inner peace that had been hard-earned over the last few weeks. As she walked up the steps, her heels clicking against the stone, Rachel Meyer walked by her side, her expression focused. determined. They were a team now, a well-oiled machine in the fight for Eleanor's freedom. Behind them, Maddie followed quietly, her hand resting lightly on her grandmother's arm. She wasn't speaking, but her presence was a silent affirmation that they were all in this together. Inside the courthouse, the hustle of attorneys, witnesses, and security guards filled the air. The grand jury was convening in a room not far from where Eleanor stood, preparing to listen to the evidence that would change everything. David had tried to dismiss the charges against him as a family dispute, but the truth had come crashing down on him in ways he had never expected. His arrogance had blinded him to the simple fact that Eleanor wasn't the easy target he had once thought her to be. This was no longer just about her financial exploitation, it was about his entire life, his freedom, and the truth that he couldn't outrun. The door to the grand jury room opened, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. A moment later, Officer Carla Ruiz stepped out, her eyes cold and resolute, her face lit with a quiet sense of victory. "They're ready to hear the case," Ruiz said, her voice low. She gave a small nod, her respect for Eleanor unspoken but clear. "This is ironclad, Eleanor. I don't see any way they could walk away without an indictment. David's involvement is clear, and Linda's." Eleanor felt a sharp pang in her chest at the mention of. She had known, deep down, that her daughter-in-law had been complicit, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms still stung. Linda, too, had turned her back on her, but this moment was not about her. It was about standing tall, about confronting the truth head-on. Eleanor nodded, her lips pressed together, her posture. She had spent too long hiding behind the veil of family. It was time to face the consequences of David and Linda's betrayal head-on. Minutes later, the grand jury returned, and the weight of their decision hung in the air like a fog. David had tried to bribe and bully his way out, but the evidence spoke for itself. The casino files had confirmed everything. David had used Eleanor's name to rack up massive gambling. Linda had been a willing accomplice, using Eleanor's accounts to fund her own lavish lifestyle. The paper trail, the texts, the bank statements, it was all there. A clerk entered the room and handed Rachel a thick packet of documents. She glanced over them quickly, her eyes scanning the text. Then she looked up at Eleanor, her face momentarily breaking into a smile. "They've been indicted," Rachel said quietly, but the words felt like a victory bell ringing in Eleanor's chest. "Fraud, elder exploitation, identity theft. They'll face trial." Eleanor stood there for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. David, once the son she had tried so hard to protect, was now the one being exposed, and Linda, too, would face justice. But it wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about reclaiming her life, reclaiming her power. In the days that followed, the case against David and Linda rapidly escalated. Maddie had been called in to testify at her deposition, and though she had been nervous, her courage shone through. She told the truth, the rawness of her testimony capturing the full scope of the betrayal. She had been caught in the middle, but she chose the side of truth, just as Eleanor had done. Victor had submitted the casino files that laid out David's debts, the gambling charges that had spiraled into identity theft. It was all laid out in black and white, irrefutable. Even David's lawyer, once confident in his defense, had backed down in the face of overwhelming evidence. Eleanor sat silently as the wheels of justice, her heart heavy but resolute. She wasn't a woman of many words, but she had a strength now that came from knowing that the truth had its own way of finding the light. The civil case was next. Rachel had already filed for restitution. David and Linda would be ordered to pay back every cent of the money they had stolen. They had stolen her peace, her trust, and so much more. But that was nothing compared to the damage they had inflicted on themselves. David would no longer be able to hide behind his manipulation. The lies would unravel, one by one, and it would be up to him to face the consequences of his action in front of a judge, a jury, and a public that had already made up its mind. Eleanor was at peace with herself. She had faced the storm and come out stronger, sharper, and unbroken. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and the truth that would follow her for the rest of her. The grand jury's indictment had been the first step toward justice, but Eleanor knew this fight wasn't just about the legalities. It was about taking back everything she had lost and proving that truth, in the end, always prevails. As she sat back in her chair, looking over the mountain of papers that now represented the beginning of the end for David and Linda, she whispered softly to herself, "You thought you had me, but I'm still standing." The storm was far from over, but the horizon was clearer now. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as the defense lawyer, a slick-haired man in an immaculate suit, stepped forward with a confident smile. He was a master manipulator, just like David, and he wasted no time in beginning his opening statement. "Your Honor," he began, turning to face the judge with calculated precision. "We're here today because of one woman's bitter vendetta against her son. Eleanor Price claims that her son David has exploited her, but the truth is far more simple. She is confused, bitter, and desperately lashing out at the very family that's tried to care for her." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten at the words, confused, bitter. The terms hit her like daggers, words that David had used against her time and time again. It was all part of his plan to paint her as the delusional, helpless old woman, easy to dismiss. But Eleanor wasn't about to let him win this time. She kept her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap, as Rachel Meyer stood beside her, silently watching the proceedings unfold. Rachel's steely eyes locked onto the defense attorney, and Eleanor could almost feel the pressure building in his chest. Rachel would take this man down, piece by piece. The lawyer continued, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "This poor woman, driven by delusion, has fabricated this entire story. She believes she's been taken advantage of by her son, but the truth is much simpler. David has been nothing but supportive, a concerned son, a loving family man." There was a wave of murmurs from the courtroom. Eleanor felt the weight of those words. He was trying to take everything, but this time, the game had changed. She wasn't going to be the one who was pushed aside, dismissed. Rachel stood, her posture a stark contrast to the defense's theatric. She spoke with measured calm, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, my client, Eleanor Price, has shown nothing but strength throughout this. This is not a case of delusion or bitterness. The evidence we've presented has been clear, concise, and irrefutable. We've proven that David Price has exploited his mother financially, using her identity without consent, running up gambling debts in her name. We've shown the paper trail, the bank record, and most crucially, the testimony of witnesses who were there." Rachel turned, gesturing toward the witness. "If there's one thing we know about Eleanor Price, it's that she's not the type to back down from the truth." David's lawyer shot a glance at his client, frustration flickering in his eyes. But he wasn't done. He turned back to the judge, addressing the court with renewed intensity. "We have a recording," he said, his voice full of self-satisfaction. "A recording made by Eleanor's granddaughter, Maddie, in which Eleanor's own words show how confused and irrational she's become. In it, she talks about things that simply don't make sense. Her testimony is unreliable." There was a shift in the room. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had feared. The moment David would try to turn Maddie against her, make her appear like an accomplice in her own downfall. She turned slowly to Maddie, who was sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, her gaze fixed on her grandmother. But then, something shifted. Maddie stood up, her face set in expression. She moved toward the front of the room, walking confidently to the witness stand. She didn't hesitate, didn't waver. As she made her way forward, her presence was like a beacon of truth in a courtroom filled with. The judge nodded for her to begin, and as Maddie sat down, she met her grandmother's eyes, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice strong. "Your Honor," she began, "I recorded the conversation my father had with my grandmother. He said things that made me question everything. The things he said about her, about how easy it was to manipulate, to make her sign things, sounded so wrong. So, I decided to record it. I couldn't stand by and watch him hurt her." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Maddie's words hung in the. David's lawyer's face turned red with anger, but there was no denying the impact Maddie's. The lawyer stood quickly, trying to regain control. "Objection, Your Honor. This recording is biased. It was made in secret, and we cannot accept it as evidence." But Rachel was already on her feet, her voice unyielding. "Your Honor, the law allows for recordings made under duress to be admissible when they're relevant to the case. And this one is crucial. It shows David's manipulative tactic, and it proves his guilt." The judge, a stern woman with little tolerance for games, leaned forward. "Objection overruled. The recording will be admitted." David's face was a mask of fury, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists, but the damage had been done. The evidence was too strong. The truth was too loud for him to drown out with his lies. Victor, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, was called next. His testimony was just as damning as Maddie's and the recorded evidence. He spoke of the casino's financial records, of how David had used Eleanor's name to run up debts, of the credit lines opened in her name without her consent. The documents were irrefutable. The case was airtight. David's lawyer knew the tide had turned. He slumped in his seat, his face pale and deflated. He had nothing left to argue. The evidence had crushed his defense. Eleanor, despite the exhaustion that was beginning to settle in her bones, remained calm, her hands steady on her lap. She wasn't confused. She wasn't bitter. She was resolute. Her eyes flicked toward the judge, and she could see the silent approval in the judge's gaze. David's defense had faltered, and with each passing moment, the walls were closing in on him. The courtroom buzzed with the realization the truth had already won. David had no more moves left. But as Eleanor sat there, her back straight, her heart steady, she knew the fight wasn't. David still had a chance to lash out, to try and destroy her one last time, but she was ready. And this time, he couldn't stop her. The courtroom was quiet as the trial began, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. The stark, cold lights above cast shadows over the figures seated in the gallery, and the air felt thick with anticipation. The jury sat at attention, their faces unreadable, as if they could feel the gravity of what was unfolding before them. The prosecutor, a tall woman with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude, stood up from her desk and moved to the front of the room. She didn't need to introduce herself. The case was already infamous. The room fell silent as she opened the binder in front of her, her voice steady and commanding as she began to lay out the charges. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "today you will hear the case of David Price, who stands accused of defrauding his own mother, Eleanor Price, through identity theft, financial exploitation, and an ongoing pattern of manipulation and deceit. The evidence presented here today will prove that David Price used his mother's identity for his own gain, accruing massive debts at casinos, forging her signature on financial documents, and exploiting her trust to fund his lifestyle." Eleanor's gaze never wavered. She was calm, steady, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't flinch at the words, nor did she let the weight of the charges shake her. This wasn't a moment of fear. It was a moment of resolution. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for. The truth was out now, and David couldn't hide from it. The prosecutor continued, her tone growing firmer with each word. "You will hear testimony from several key witnesses today. We will present proof of fraudulent casino records, and even text messages that show David Price's intent to deceive his own mother, knowing full well that she was vulnerable and trusting." As the prosecutor moved to her next, Rachel Meyer, Eleanor's attorney, stood to present her evidence. She moved with the precision of a seasoned fighter, her hands steady as she opened a folder containing a thick binder. She looked at the jury and then back at the judge, before speaking directly to, "Your Honor, members of the jury," Rachel began, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What we are about to show you is irrefutable proof that David Price abused his position as his mother's son. These are the bank statements that show repeated withdrawals, made without her consent. These are the casino records that prove David used Eleanor's player card to rack up debt in her name. And these are the text messages where David brags about how easy it was to manipulate his mother into signing documents." Rachel paused, then turned to the judge. "The evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor. David Price knew exactly what he was doing, and he used his mother's trust as a weapon." The prosecutor called her first witness, Officer Carla Ruiz. The financial crimes investigator stepped forward, her posture confident, her expression unreadable. She walked to the stand, swearing an oath, and then began to testify about the bank transfers and the steps she had taken to trace the fraudulent activity in Eleanor's accounts. "Based on my investigation," Ruiz began, her voice steady and "I was able to confirm that David Price transferred large sums of money from Eleanor's accounts to his own. These transfers were made over the course of several months, and they were unauthorized. The money was used for gambling debts that David accumulated at various casinos." Ruiz detailed each transfer, her methodical explanations adding weight to the already overwhelming case against David. Every number she recited felt like another nail in the coffin as defense. The prosecutor then called Victor Chen, the casino dealer who had first revealed David's gambling habits. He stepped up to the witness stand, his demeanor just as calm as ever. He explained how David had used Eleanor's player card to run up debt, how he had seen David's reckless gambling firsthand, and how the casino had recorded Eleanor's name on multiple credit lines that had been fraudulently opened in her name. Victor's testimony hit the courtroom like a punch to the gut. Every word seemed to tighten the noose around David's neck. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. Not this time. Finally, it was Maddie's turn. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as her granddaughter stood up from the back of the room and made her way to the witness. Maddie had been hesitant, but Eleanor knew how much this meant. Her voice, steady and clear, rang out across the courtroom. "My name is Maddie Price," she said, her eyes meeting the jury's. "And I'm here because my father, David, hurt my grandmother. He used her name to open accounts and steal money. I recorded a conversation I overheard between my father and my grandmother, and I did it because I knew something wasn't right." The jury listened intently as Maddie played the recording, a conversation between her father and her grandmother where David bragged about manipulating Eleanor, about how easy it was to get her to sign documents, to use her trust to line his own pocket. David's face twisted his eyes flashing with anger, but he said nothing. The recording spoke louder than any defense he could muster. Eleanor sat there, her body rigid, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She didn't look at Dave, but she could feel his gaze burning into the heat of his fury as he realized he was losing, and losing badly. The jury was watching closely now, their eyes never leaving Maddie. She had told the truth, and it was undeniable. There was no going back for David. The walls had closed in, and there was nowhere left to run. Rachel turned to the judge, her face calm but resolute. "This is the case against David Price, Your Honor. This is the man who exploited his own mother for his own gain, and we have the evidence to prove it." As the tension in the room grew thicker, Eleanor remained still, her face a mask of quiet determination. She had waited a lifetime for this moment, her truth, her story, finally being told. And now, it was in the hands of the jury. But as the judge called for a brief recess, Eleanor allowed herself a single, quiet moment. No matter what happened next, she had already won. The courtroom fell silent as the judge's gavel hit the sound block. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but her body remained still, poised. Her hands, which had once trembled with fear and doubt, now sat steady in her lap. She had lived through a lifetime of whispers, of accusations, and now, here it was, the culmination of everything she had fought for. It was finally time for the truth to be known. The jury filed back into the room after a long deliberation. The air was thick with anticipation. Eleanor could feel the weight of every step they took, the tension in their faces as they found their... She didn't look at David, didn't need to. She could sense him beside, his presence like a dark cloud, seething with anger and frustration. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge's voice broke through the stillness. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman of the jury stood up, his expression grave. He turned to face the judge, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "We have reached a verdict." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, but she kept her eyes forward, her focus sharp. "The jury finds the defendant, David Price, guilty of elder fraud and financial exploitation," the foreman continued. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom, and for a moment, Eleanor dared to let her guard down. She had known, deep down, that the truth would prevail, but hearing it said aloud felt like the first breath she had taken in months. The room seemed to pulse with energy as David's face contorted into an expression, his jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides. He glanced around the courtroom as if expecting someone to step in, to intervene, but there was no one. The walls were closing in on him. The game was up. Additionally, the foreman continued, "The jury finds Linda Price complicit in these crimes, aiding and abetting David Price in the fraudulent actions carried out against Eleanor Price. Linda Price will face probation and further legal consequences as determined by the court." Eleanor's stomach churned at the words, but she kept her face composed. Linda's betrayal had been a knife in her heart, one she hadn't been ready to face, and to see it acknowledged in this moment, by the jury, by the court, was a bitter but necessary victory. Linda's role in this had been as vile as David. She had chosen to stand by him, to aid him in taking everything from Eleanor. The judge then addressed the room with a voice that rang out like a verdict itself. "David Price will be stripped of all inheritance rights. He will no longer have access to any financial holdings or assets related to Eleanor Price. In addition, restitution is to be paid in full, with immediate effect, to Mrs. Price." Eleanor's breath caught in her chest as the finality of the words sank in. She had won. David had no claim on anything that belonged to her. Her assets, her life, they were finally her own again. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long was lifted in that one moment. It was over. The judge's gaze shifted to David, who was now slumped in his chair, his face pale with shock and humiliation. His fate had been sealed, and there was nothing more he could do. Mrs. Price, the judge continued, turning to Eleanor, the court has no doubt that you have suffered tremendously. The evidence is clear, and justice has been served. A quiet sigh escaped Eleanor's lips. She didn't speak, didn't need. She had fought for her truth, and now it was finally acknowledged. She was free. As the gavel came down once more, Maddie rushed forward, her arms outstretched, and pulled her grandmother into a fierce hug. Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion as Maddie wrapped her arms around her, the weight of everything finally lifting from her shoulders. You did it, Grandma, Maddie whispered, her voice breaking slightly. We did it. Eleanor hugged her granddaughter back, her heart full. We did, she whispered. We really did. Victor, who had been standing quietly off to the side, nodded toward Eleanor with a small, respectful smile. He had been a quiet ally throughout this ordeal, and now, his steady presence seemed like an acknowledgement of everything she had overcome. Bad luck, huh? Eleanor whispered to her, her lips curling into a small, triumphant smile. She looked up at Maddie, who was still holding her tightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor allowed herself to truly smile, a smile that came from a place of strength, of liberation. David was staring at her, his eyes burning with rage and disbelief, but Eleanor didn't need to look back at him. He had been the one to lose, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, Eleanor could finally breathe freely. The battle was over, and she had won. Eleanor sat quietly on the porch, the golden light of the late afternoon casting long, soft shadows across the wooden floor. The air was crisp, with a faint breeze rustling the trees that lined her property. The world outside felt peaceful, almost serene, as if the chaos of the past months had melted away with the setting sun. The tea in her hands was warm, comforting. She lifted the cup to her lips, savoring the simplicity of the moment. There was a stillness now that had been absent for so long. No more courtroom, no more legal battle, no more fear, just the quiet hum of nature surrounding. Maddie sat beside her, her textbooks spread across the table, and she was absorbed in her studies. But every now and then her gaze would flicker to Eleanor, a silent acknowledgement that they were both, at last, free. The tension between them, between the world that had threatened to tear them apart and the bond that had held them together, had dissolved, leaving only a quiet understanding. Eleanor glanced over at her granddaughter, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her. The girl was growing up fast, her shoulders broadening with the weight of everything she had, and yet, there was an innocence. Eleanor was proud of her, proud that Maddie had stood by her side, unwavering in the face of everything. The ringing of the phone broke the silence. Eleanor set her tea down, a little reluctantly, and picked up the receiver. Hello? Her voice was calm, but her heart still skipped a beat at the sound of any call. Eleanor? It's Victor. The voice on the other end was steady and comforting. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. After everything, I thought you might need to hear a friendly voice. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, appreciating this. Victor had been there for her, in his quiet way, ever since the first day they had met in the... His support had been a constant, steady, unyielding, like the earth beneath her. I'm all right, she said softly, her voice steady. Really, I am. It's just different now, you know? Things are settling, but it feels like I'm still waiting for the dust to... Victor's voice softened, understanding the weight of her words. You've been through hell, Eleanor, but I can hear it in your voice. You're stronger than you think. Eleanor's eyes wandered back to Maddie, still deep in her books. I know. It's just been a long time coming, you know. She paused. I'm safe now. There was a silence on the other end of the line, and then Victor spoke again, his tone warm. Good. You deserve peace, Eleanor. You really do. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. You know that. She smiled at the thought of him. Victor, the quiet man who had watched over her, understood her struggle, and had never asked for anything. I will, she replied softly, before hanging up. The wind picked up slightly, and Maddie's voice broke the silence. Grandma? Her tone was tentative, but Eleanor could see the question in her granddaughter's eyes before she even spoke it. Eleanor turned to face her, her smile gentle. Yes, sweetheart, you won. Maddie said quietly, her eyes soft with the weight of what they'd both been through. You really won. Eleanor nodded slowly, her heart swelling with a bittersweet pride. Yes, she whispered, almost to herself. I did. The evening stretched out before them, and the world felt lighter, like it had been scrubbed clean by the truth. The golden light seemed to hold everything in place, making the simple act of being together feel like a quiet victory. For the first time in so long, Eleanor felt safe. Safe in her home, safe with Maddie, and most importantly, safe with herself. She had stood up for what was right, and she had been heard. The storm had passed. The fight had been long, but it was over now, and in its wake, there was nothing but the quiet of the evening settled around them, and Eleanor sipped her tea once more, her heart steady and her mind clear. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. It was over. She had her life back. And in the soft glow of the evening light, she whispered again, almost as if to reassure herself, safe again. Maddie turned her gaze to the horizon, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, and together they sat in silence. Peace had finally found them. The auditorium was packed. The faint murmur of conversation faded as Eleanor took her place at the podium. Her hands were steady, her posture tall, though she felt a flutter of nerves in her chest. The room was filled with people who understood the importance of the moment, the weight of the cause, but to Eleanor, it still felt surreal. She had been sitting in the back row at events like this before, listening, nodding, and admiring the strength of others. But today, she was the one standing at the front. Today, her story would be the one to inspire. Maddie sat in the front row, her eyes shining with pride, her posture straight as a rod, her presence in the audience the steadying force Eleanor. Rachel sat next to her, a supportive smile on her face, her arms crossed with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they had already won. The applause quieted, and Eleanor adjusted the microphone before speaking. The room was watching, waiting for her words. Thank you, Eleanor. Her voice softer, but it carried, filling the room. Thank you for letting me be here today, for giving me the space to tell my story. She paused, her gaze flicking briefly to Maddie, who returned her look with a proud smile. The moment of vulnerability felt as though it might swallow her whole, but she steeled herself. This was she had earned. When I first found out what my son David had done to me, she continued, her voice growing steadier, I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. The man I had raised, loved, protected, he had used my name, my trust, to drain me. And when I found out I was no longer just a mother, I became a victim. I became a target, a statistic. Eleanor's eyes swept the room. She could see the empathy in their faces, the nods of recognition. She wasn't alone in this. The hardest part, though, wasn't the money. It wasn't the debts or the lies. It was the betrayal. The realization that someone I had spent my life nurturing had turned on me so completely. She paused, her voice faltering just a moment before gathering strength. But, it wasn't the loss of money that hurt the most. It was the feeling of being invisible, of being overlooked, underestimated. The world assumes, when you're older, that you no longer matter, that you can't fight back. But I'm here to tell you that isn't true. You can fight back. You must fight. She let the words settle. The weight of her testimony hung in the air, and she could feel the shift in the room. They were with her now. Like many of you, I've spent my life fighting for my family, fighting for my students. And then, one day, I found myself in a courtroom fighting for myself, fighting for my dignity, my identity, my right to live free of fear and manipulation. And in that fight, I learned that the truth is the most powerful weapon we have. Eleanor reached down and opened the folder in front of her, the binder of evidence. She had carried it into the courtroom, and now she held it before this audience, a symbol of the years of work, of hard-won truth. David thought he could use me. He thought I was just another pawn in his game, she said, her voice now filled with quiet defiance. But when the dealer turned the cards, it wasn't me who lost. It was him. The room was still, and then the applause started, slow at first, but building, rising like a wave. Eleanor didn't expect the standing ovation, but it came, rolling over her like a tide. She stood there, unmoving, as the applause continued. Maddie's face was bright with pride, Rachel's smile wide and approving. The energy in the room was electric, and Eleanor allowed herself to bask in the moment, in the recognition, in the validation. She had stood up for herself, and the world was applauding her for it. The applause slowed, And Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice returning to a quiet, almost intimate. You know, she said, her words now calm and filled with quiet strength. For too long, I let people decide what my life should. I let them think that my age made me invisible. But I found my voice, and I fought for the truth. And I'm not the only one here who has fought. This is a fight we all need to. The room was silent, listening and hanging on her every word. I'll tell you one last thing, Eleanor said, her eyes sweeping the audience one last time. Luck doesn't decide, evidence does. And when you stand for the truth, when you stand for what's right, there's nothing anyone can do to take. With that, Eleanor gave a final, graceful nod to the audience, and as she stepped back from the podium, the applause rose again, louder, longer, a standing ovation that felt like the final, victorious note in her battle. As the room calmed, Eleanor walked off the stage, her feet light, her heart full. She had spoken the truth, and the world had listened. And for the first time in years, she felt truly free.